The first time he saw the bruises, she was trying to pretend they did not exist. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from tonight, because stories like this remind us that no matter where we are in the world, courage and love can still find us. And if you believe in second chances and unexpected heroes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story that might touch your heart. The bruises no one saw. Miss Clara Whitmore stood perfectly still in the drawing room of her mother's townhouse, her gloved hands folded neatly before her, her chin lifted with practiced composure. Anyone who glanced at her would have seen nothing unusual, merely a quiet young lady of modest beauty and impeccable manners. But beneath the lace cuff at her wrist, dark fingerprints marked her skin. Her mother's voice cut sharply through the air behind her. "You will stand straight when you are addressed." Clara obeyed instantly, shoulders stiffening. She had learned long ago that hesitation only worsened consequences. Lady Margaret Whitmore was admired in society, elegant, commanding, widowed with dignity. Few knew the truth hidden behind the polished veneer. Fewer still would have believed it. To the outside world, Margaret was a devoted mother. Inside their home, she was something else entirely. The slap came without warning. Clara's head turned with the force of it, the sting blooming across her cheek, but she did not cry out. She never cried out anymore. Tears only provoked lectures about weakness. "You embarrass me," Margaret hissed. "Do you understand how fortunate you are? Without me, you would have nothing, nothing!" Clara lowered her gaze. "Yes, mother." The words tasted like dust. There had been a time, years ago, when Clara believed obedience might earn affection, when she believed kindness could be coaxed from the woman who had given her life. But that hope had withered slowly, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous: resignation. She endured because endurance was survival. That afternoon, however, fate intervened in a way neither woman could have anticipated. The Whitmore townhouse was hosting a small gathering, nothing grand, merely a social tea intended to maintain appearances. Clara moved through the guests with graceful efficiency, pouring tea, offering pastries, smiling politely when spoken to. It was while she reached for a tray that her sleeve shifted slightly. The bruise became visible, and someone noticed. Sebastian Hale, Duke of Ravenshire, had not intended to attend the gathering at all. His presence alone altered the atmosphere of any room. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a reputation carved from equal parts power and fear. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Some called him ruthless, others called him dangerous. Few dared approach him, fewer understood him. He stood near the mantel, listening with mild impatience to a gentleman's tedious commentary, when his gaze drifted across the room and landed on Clara. At first, it was nothing more than idle observation. Then he saw her wrist. The bruise was unmistakable. Sebastian's attention sharpened instantly. He watched her more closely, the slight flinch when her mother spoke, the careful positioning of her hands, the way her shoulders tightened when Margaret moved too near. Recognition stirred in his chest, not of the situation itself, but of the emotion behind it. Fear. Not the fleeting nervousness of social anxiety, true fear, the kind that lived in bones. Memories he rarely allowed himself surfaced unbidden. His own childhood under a tyrannical guardian after his parents' deaths, the cold corridors, the punishments, the helplessness. His jaw tightened. Across the room, Margaret's voice rose again, sharp with irritation. Clara dropped a spoon, the clatter echoing briefly. Margaret's hand gripped her daughter's arm hard enough to make Clara wince. And that was when Sebastian moved. The room seemed to shift as he approached, conversations faltering. Margaret turned, surprise flickering across her face before she masked it with charm. "Your Grace," she said smoothly. "What an honor!" Sebastian's gaze did not leave Clara. "Is it?" he replied quietly. The tension was immediate, palpable. Clara dared not look up, but she felt it, the change in the air, the awareness that something significant was happening. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her not with indifference, but with concern. It frightened her almost as much as her mother did. Sebastian spoke again, voice calm but edged with steel. "You are hurting her." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. Margaret laughed lightly. "Surely you misunderstand." "I do not misunderstand." Silence spread among the guests. Clara's heart pounded violently. No one had ever said those words aloud before. No one had ever acknowledged what was happening. Margaret's grip tightened. "You overstep, Your Grace." Sebastian's expression darkened. "Release her." For a moment, it seemed Margaret might refuse. Then, under the weight of his presence, she let go. Clara swayed slightly, shocked more by the absence of pain than by anything else. Sebastian's voice softened when he addressed her directly. "Miss Whitmore, are you safe here?" The question shattered something inside her. Safe? She did not remember the last time anyone had asked that. Her throat tightened, words refused to come. Sebastian understood anyway. And in that moment, without either of them realizing it, the course of both their lives changed forever. A reputation of fear. Fear had always followed the Duke of Ravenshire like a shadow that refused to leave him. In the weeks after the gathering where he first noticed Miss Clara Whitmore's bruised wrist, Sebastian Hale found himself increasingly distracted, a condition he neither welcomed nor understood. He was not a man prone to fascination, nor one easily moved by sentiment. His life had been shaped by discipline, strategy, and control. Emotion, in his experience, was a liability. And yet, the image of her lingered. The slight tremor in her fingers, the way she lowered her eyes too quickly, the unmistakable tension when her mother touched her arm. He had seen fear before. He recognized it instinctively, the way a soldier recognizes the scent of gunpowder long before hearing the explosion. It irritated him that he could not dismiss it. Sebastian stood in his study at Ravenshire House, a sprawling London residence built to reflect the power of its owner. The walls were lined with dark wood shelves filled with ledgers, legal documents, and volumes of military history. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, casting amber light across the room. His steward, Mr. Collingwood, stood nearby reviewing estate accounts. "The northern tenants have submitted requests for repairs, Your Grace," the older man said. Sebastian nodded absently. "Approve them." "Yes, Your Grace." Collingwood hesitated, clearly aware his employer's attention was elsewhere. "Is there anything further?" Sebastian asked without looking up. "No, Your Grace." The steward withdrew quietly, closing the door behind him. Sebastian exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. He did not like distractions. But memory had a way of surfacing when least convenient. He crossed the room to the window overlooking the courtyard, his mind drifting backward, not to Clara Whitmore, but to his own childhood. He had not always been the feared Duke of Ravenshire. Once he had been a boy desperate for approval. After his parents died when he was 9, Sebastian had been placed under the guardianship of his uncle, Lord Edmund Hale. Society had praised the arrangement as fortunate. His uncle was wealthy, influential, disciplined, precisely the sort of man expected to shape a future duke. What society did not see was the cruelty behind closed doors. Edmund believed weakness must be eradicated. Mistakes were punished. Emotion was forbidden. Sebastian learned quickly that silence was safer than protest, that obedience prevented pain, that fear could live quietly beneath perfectly composed behavior. Bruises hidden beneath sleeves, flinches disguised as politeness. By 16, Sebastian had stopped feeling like a child altogether. By 20, he had inherited the dukedom and the freedom that came with it. But scars remained, not visible ones. the kind that shaped a man's entire character. He had vowed never to be powerless again, never to allow anyone to control him, never to tolerate cruelty where he had the authority to stop it, which was precisely why Clara Whitmore unsettled him so deeply. She reminded him of a version of himself he rarely acknowledged. A knock sounded at the door, pulling him from his thoughts. "Enter." His friend and occasional confidant, Lord Nathaniel Ashford, stepped inside without ceremony. "You look as though you're contemplating war," Nathaniel said lightly. "Should I be concerned?" Sebastian turned back toward the fire. "Only irritated." "By what?" Sebastian hesitated, an unusual occurrence. "A young woman." Nathaniel raised a brow. "Well, that is new." "Not in the way you imply," Sebastian replied dryly. Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Of course, continue." Sebastian described the encounter at the Whitmore gathering, the bruises, the behavior, Margaret Whitmore's controlling grip. Nathaniel's expression sobered. "You believe she is being abused?" Sebastian's jaw tightened. "I have not decided." Nathaniel studied him carefully. "You already have," he said quietly. Sebastian did not respond, because it was true. The following days only strengthened his suspicion. Society gossip, usually beneath his notice, began revealing patterns once he listened for them. Mentions of Margaret Whitmore's temper, comments about her daughter's withdrawn nature, observations that Clara rarely attended events without visible anxiety. No one called it abuse, they called it unfortunate temperament. Sebastian felt anger coil slowly in his chest, cowardice disguised as politeness. A week later, fate presented another opportunity. A charity auction at a grand hall near Hyde Park drew much of London's aristocracy. Sebastian attended reluctantly, compelled by obligation rather than interest. He had not expected to see Clara there, but he noticed her immediately. She stood near the edge of the room, pale blue gown, modest compared to the elaborate fashions surrounding her. Her posture was straight but tense, as though she were bracing herself for impact. Margaret Whitmore stood beside her, smiling graciously while speaking to acquaintances. Sebastian watched carefully. Within minutes, he saw it again. The subtle correction of Clara's posture with a sharp pinch at her elbow, the whispered reprimand behind a polite smile, the way Clara's shoulders tightened instinctively. Rage stirred beneath Sebastian's calm exterior. Nathaniel approached his side. "You are right," his friend murmured quietly after observing the interaction. "That is not discipline, that is control." Sebastian nodded once. Across the room, Clara's gaze lifted briefly and met his. For a moment, time seemed to pause. There was recognition in her eyes, and something else. Hope. It struck him unexpectedly hard. Hope was dangerous. Hope meant she was waiting for someone to save her. Sebastian had spent his life ensuring he never needed saving, but he knew what it meant to wish for it. Margaret suddenly grabbed Clara's wrist, pulling her closer with visible irritation. Clara flinched. That was enough. Sebastian moved forward. The crowd parted instinctively, his presence commanding space without effort. Conversations softened as people noticed his approach. Margaret turned, surprise flickering across her face before she replaced it with charm. "Your Grace," she said smoothly. Sebastian ignored her. His focus remained on Clara. Up close, he could see faint yellowing bruises along her collarbone, partially concealed by lace. His voice was low when he spoke. "Miss Whitmore." Clara's breath caught. "Yes, Your Grace." "Are you well?" The question was simple, but no one had asked her that before. Margaret laughed lightly. "My daughter is perfectly well. She is merely sensitive." Sebastian's eyes shifted to Margaret, cold, unyielding. "I was not speaking to you." Silence fell around them. Clara's heart pounded violently. She did not know what to say, because the truth felt too dangerous to speak aloud. Sebastian understood, and in that moment he made a decision. He would not ignore this. He would not walk away, because once, long ago, he had prayed someone would do the same for him. The moment of intervention. The first time Clara Whitmore realized her life might change forever was not when the Duke of Ravenshire spoke to her. It was when her mother raised her hand to strike her in front of an entire ballroom. The charity auction hall shimmered with candlelight, chandeliers casting golden reflections across polished marble floors. Music drifted softly from a quartet near the far wall, and conversation filled the air in a gentle hum of aristocratic civility. To anyone observing from afar, the evening appeared elegant and orderly, but Clara felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. Her mother's grip on her wrist tightened painfully, nails pressing into tender skin where old bruises had only just begun to fade. Margaret Whitmore's smile remained perfectly composed as she spoke to a nearby acquaintance, yet her fingers communicated a different message entirely. Stand properly. Do not embarrass me. Do not fail again. Clara forced herself to remain still, her pulse racing beneath the suffocating pressure of expectation. She had endured moments like this her entire life, but tonight something felt different. Fragile, unstable, as though the careful balance she maintained might collapse at any moment. Perhaps it was because the Duke stood only a few feet away. Sebastian Hale's presence altered the atmosphere around him like a storm cloud gathering in clear skies. People watched him with equal parts admiration and unease, their voices lowering instinctively when he moved through the room. And he was watching her. Clara could feel it, the weight of his attention, steady and unwavering. It made her both comforted and terrified. No one had ever looked at her with such focused concern before. It felt as though he could see every hidden wound she carried. Margaret noticed. Her smile tightened, irritation flashing behind her eyes. "Stop staring," she whispered sharply to Clara. "You will make yourself appear foolish." "I was not—" Margaret's fingers dug deeper into her arm. "You will behave," she hissed. Pain radiated through Clara's wrist, but she remained silent. Resistance only escalated consequences. Across the room, Sebastian saw the exchange clearly. Something inside him snapped. He had tolerated cruelty in silence once before in his life, endured it because he had no power to stop it. But he was no longer a helpless boy. He was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, and he would not stand by while another person suffered the way he had. Margaret abruptly released Clara and turned toward a nearby table displaying auction items. A delicate porcelain figurine caught her attention, and she reached for it impatiently. "Hold this," she ordered, thrusting it toward Clara without waiting for readiness. Clara's hands were still trembling from the pain in her wrist. As she accepted the fragile object, her fingers faltered. The figurine slipped. Time seemed to slow. Porcelain struck marble. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Conversation stopped instantly. All eyes turned toward the sound. Clara froze, horror flooding her chest. I'm sorry," she whispered. Margaret's face transformed. The mask of polite society shattered, revealing pure fury. "You incompetent girl!" she snapped, her voice rising louder than propriety allowed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Clara's throat tightened. I didn't mean—" The slap came fast and hard. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara's head jerked sideways, pain exploding across her cheek. Tears sprang to her eyes involuntarily, humiliation burning hotter than the physical sting. Never before had her mother struck her so publicly. Margaret raised her hand again, but it never reached its target. Sebastian Hale's hand closed around Margaret's wrist mid-motion. The movement was swift, controlled, and utterly decisive. The room fell into stunned silence. Margaret stared at him, shock overtaking anger for the first time. "Release me," she demanded. Sebastian's voice was low, dangerously calm. "You will not touch her again." The authority in his tone sent a visible ripple through the onlookers. No one questioned him. No one dared intervene. Margaret attempted to pull her arm free, but his grip did not loosen. "You presume too much, Your Grace," she said sharply. "She is my daughter." Sebastian's eyes darkened. "She is a human being, and you are harming her." Clara's heart pounded so violently she feared she might collapse. She could not process what was happening. No one had ever defended her before. Not a friend, not a relative, not even a servant. Certainly not a duke. Margaret laughed bitterly. "You know nothing of discipline. She is weak, ungrateful, everything I have sacrificed. Enough." The single word carried the weight of command. Margaret fell silent. Sebastian released her wrist slowly, but his body shifted subtly, placing himself between mother and daughter. The protective gesture was unmistakable. He turned toward Clara. Up close, she could see the controlled anger in his eyes, not directed at her, but at the situation itself. And beneath it, something gentler. Concern. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "look at me." She hesitated, fear battling instinct. Then she lifted her gaze. "What happened here?" he asked. The question seemed simple, yet it carried immense weight. He was offering her a choice, truth or silence. Clara's lips trembled. I dropped the figurine," she whispered. "And before that?" Her breath caught. Margaret's presence loomed behind him like a threat. Years of conditioning screamed at her to deny everything, but Sebastian's gaze held steady, patient, unwavering. Safe. The words surfaced in her mind again. Safe. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "She was angry," she said softly. "I often make mistakes." The understatement struck Sebastian like a blade. He saw the bruises beneath her sleeve, the fear in her posture, the automatic self-blame. Rage surged through him, cold, controlled, lethal. He turned back toward Margaret. "You will apologize," he said. Margaret stared at him as though he had spoken nonsense. "I will do no such thing." "Then understand this," Sebastian continued evenly. "If you raise a hand against her, in public or private, I will ensure every door in society closes to you permanently." The shock spread through the crowd. The threat was unmistakable and entirely credible. Margaret's face flushed with fury and humiliation. "You would ruin me over a childish accident?" "I would ruin you for cruelty." Silence stretched. Finally, Margaret forced out the words through clenched teeth. "I apologize." The apology was hollow, insincere, but it was the first time Clara had ever heard such words directed toward her. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Sebastian turned back to her, his voice softening again. "You are coming with me." Clara blinked, startled. My mother?" "We'll manage," he said firmly. Margaret began to protest, but Sebastian's gaze stopped her instantly. Without fully understanding why, Clara allowed him to guide her away from the center of the ballroom, through the watching crowd, toward the quieter corridor beyond. Her heart raced with confusion, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. For the first time in her life, someone had intervened, someone powerful, someone unafraid. And as the doors closed behind them, separating her from the suffocating scrutiny of society and the shadow of her mother's control, Clara realized something profound. Her life had just changed. She simply did not yet know how much. Sanctuary in Unexpected Hands. Clara Whitmore walked through the quiet corridors of Ravenshire Manor, each step feeling surreal, as though she had crossed into another world entirely. The grandeur around her was overwhelming. High ceilings adorned with gilded moldings, walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her every move, and a faint scent of polished wood and candle wax lingering in the air. It was a stark contrast to the chaos she had just escaped in the ballroom, where her mother's cruelty had been on full display. She kept her gaze lowered, hands clasped tightly in front of her, as Sebastian Hale led the way. The Duke of Ravenshire moved with the calm authority of a man who commanded respect not through fear alone, but through the certainty of his presence. Clara had seen the reaction he provoked in the ballroom. Whispers ceased, heads turned, and even the most self-important ladies and gentlemen dared not meet his gaze. Yet now, away from the public eye, she felt both exposed and strangely safe under his silent vigilance. "You will remain here tonight," Sebastian said, his voice low but firm, breaking the tense silence. "Tomorrow we will arrange for your comfort and security for as long as necessary." Clara's throat tightened. She had no words for the sudden shift in her life. I cannot impose, Your Grace," she murmured, the habitual fear creeping back. "It is not proper for me to—" "You do not impose," Sebastian interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "No one has the right to subject you to harm. That ends tonight." His words reverberated in her mind. Ends tonight. The certainty in his voice was unlike anything she had ever known. She wanted to believe him, but fear rooted her to the spot. After all, she had survived her entire life by keeping quiet, by shrinking in the shadows, by enduring the cruelty of a mother who should have protected her. Trusting a man, even a duke, felt perilous. The duke stopped at a pair of imposing doors leading to a private wing of the manor. Sebastian's hand gestured for her to enter. Clara hesitated, swallowing hard. "Your Grace, will I be safe here?" "You will be protected," he said simply. "No one will harm you under my roof, not now, not ever." The simplicity of the statement shocked her. For years she had been conditioned to expect danger, to anticipate blows and harsh words. To hear assurance without condition, without argument or hesitation, was almost unbearable. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. She could not afford to show weakness, not yet. A maid approached quietly, bowing politely. "Miss Whitmore, your suite has been prepared. May I assist you?" Clara nodded, barely trusting her voice. She allowed the woman to guide her through the hallways, past paintings of long-dead nobles and rooms she could only imagine hosting grand banquets. The suite itself was magnificent, a large chamber with tall windows draped in pale silk curtains, a roaring fire warming the hearth, and a bed so soft it seemed unreal. Fresh linens and a modest bouquet of flowers completed the scene. Clara felt dizzy from the sudden kindness and attention. For a moment, she feared it was a dream she might wake from at any second. "Please rest," the maid said gently. "You have traveled far, and tonight has been difficult." Clara nodded silently, watching the flickering firelight as it danced across the walls. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself a small thought. Maybe she could survive. Maybe she could even begin to heal. Later, she found Sebastian in the library. The room was vast and quiet, filled with the faint scent of old leather and burning logs. Shelves climbed to the ceiling, stacked with volumes that seemed as endless as the possibilities now opening before her. Sebastian looked up from the papers he had been reviewing. His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable, but not unkind. "You should rest," he said. "I wished to thank you, Your Grace," she replied softly, still unaccustomed to addressing him directly without fear. "You owe me nothing, Clara," he said, closing the folder in front of him. You have endured more than anyone should. My concern is not courtesy, it is justice." Justice. The words struck her deeply. Not pity, not protection out of obligation, but a recognition that she had been wronged. She nodded, unable to speak, as he regarded her with a careful intensity that made her feel both scrutinized and valued. In the days that followed, Clara began to settle into life at Ravenshire Manor, slowly adjusting to the rhythms and expectations of her new surroundings. Morning walks in the gardens brought fresh air and a freedom she had never known. Afternoons spent in the library with Sebastian's supervision allowed her intellect to emerge, long buried beneath fear and obedience. Evening meals were quiet, composed affairs, and for the first time, Clara could eat without anxiety gnawing at her. Sebastian was not effusive. He did not offer easy smiles or frequent praise. Instead, he observed, guided, and occasionally challenged her, always attentive to her growth and well-being. She noticed the small details he remembered, her preference for certain teas, the way she flinched when someone raised a hand, the hint of bruising she tried to hide. Each acknowledgement, though quiet, made her feel seen in a way that no one else ever had. Yet, alongside comfort, there was tension, an undercurrent neither spoke of. A glance lingering too long, a hand brushing by accident, the unspoken awareness that proximity meant more than protection. Clara felt it, her heart quickening when Sebastian entered the room, the knowledge of his attention both thrilling and frightening. One evening, on the terrace, as the sunset bathed the gardens in gold, their hands brushed. Both froze. A spark of emotion surged through Clara, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She stepped back quickly, murmuring, "I should retire." Sebastian inclined his head, jaw tight. Of course, but his eyes lingered on her, steady and penetrating, as though measuring not only her presence, but her courage and worth. Alone in her suite that night, Clara stared at the ceiling, thoughts swirling. She had entered Ravenshire Manor a frightened, battered girl. Yet here, under the watchful care of the Duke, she began to sense a new possibility, a life where she could be safe, respected, and perhaps even valued. Sanctuary was no longer a place, she realized. It was Sebastian Hale himself, and that realization was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. Healing and awakening. The first days at Ravenshire Manor were a mixture of fear, awe, and tentative hope for Clara Whitmore. Each morning, as the first light of dawn seeped through the tall windows of her suite, she felt the lingering weight of her mother's cruelty pressing upon her shoulders, a shadow she could not yet shake. And yet, in the quiet of Sebastian Hale's manor, in the presence of the Duke of Ravenshire himself, she found the beginnings of something new, something that resembled safety. Breakfasts were served with polite silence, the butler observing every detail with meticulous care, while Clara tried to navigate the formalities without faltering. Sebastian did not hover, did not instruct her as a child. He simply existed in the same space, his presence commanding, vigilant, protective. Each glance carried unspoken questions, each subtle gesture acknowledged her, her fears, her strengths, her fragile but unbroken spirit. She began to understand that he was as much a guardian as he was a mentor, and the distinction made her chest tighten with a mix of gratitude and apprehension. In the afternoons, she would accompany him to the library, a vast room filled with volumes whose leather spines smelled of age and knowledge. Sebastian encouraged her curiosity, guiding her through literature, history, and even foreign languages. For Clara, each lesson was a revelation. Each skill she acquired chipped away at the years of self-doubt instilled by Margaret Whitmore. She discovered humor within herself she had long suppressed, cleverness in observation, and a quiet confidence that surprised even her. The bruises beneath her sleeves remained, silent witnesses to a life once constrained, but now her spirit began to unfurl. Sebastian, ever watchful, noticed every small triumph and setback. He would sometimes stand behind her as she read aloud, listening to the cadence of her voice, noting how she flinched at certain words or stumbled over a phrase. "You are capable of more than you realize, Miss Whitmore," he said one evening, his voice low, almost intimate. "You have endured a lifetime of cruelty, yet here you stand, still learning, still observing. That is strength." Clara's lips trembled. Praise had always been scarce, and now it felt heavy with meaning, as if the words themselves carried warmth she had never known. Her gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment she saw not the feared Duke of Ravenshire, the man who commanded obedience with a single glance, but someone profoundly human, someone who recognized her pain and still chose to stand by her. Days blended into weeks. Slowly, Clara allowed herself to explore the manor, wandering through gardens dusted with frost, inhaling the crisp winter air, and discovering hidden alcoves and quiet corners where the world could not touch her. Each small step reinforced the idea that she was more than a victim. She was a person with desires, thoughts, and the right to exist without fear. Sebastian would occasionally join her on these walks, silent companions in the cold, sharing a quiet understanding that needed no words. When their hands brushed accidentally against a frozen railing or while reaching for the same flower, a warmth would surge through her chest, leaving her both frightened and exhilarated. Evenings became a time of reflection and subtle connection. The fire crackled in the great hearth, casting shadows across their faces as they sat across from one another. Sometimes Sebastian would speak of the manor's history, of the ancestors whose portraits lined the walls, and of the burdens of his title. Other times, he would simply observe Clara in thoughtful silence, his dark eyes never wavering from her. The silence was not empty, it was charged with unspoken acknowledgement. Clara began to recognize the unsteady rhythm of her own heartbeat whenever he looked at her, a sensation both terrifying and thrilling. There were moments, however, when the past threatened to reclaim her. Nightmares of her mother's cruel laughter, the sharp sting of past slaps, and the constant shadow of judgment would awaken her from sleep. In those moments, Sebastian's presence was a balm. He did not force her to speak, but would sometimes place a steadying hand near hers on the table or offer a quiet word of reassurance. "You are safe here," he would say, and the repetition, day after day, became a lifeline she clung to desperately. Clara began to notice subtle changes in herself, the way she held her head higher during meals, the small laugh that escaped when she stumbled over a humorous anecdote in a book, the ease with which she moved through corridors without flinching at imagined judgment. The girl who had spent years shrinking from attention was slowly reclaiming her life, stitch by delicate stitch, under the unyielding but compassionate guidance of Sebastian Hale. And yet, beneath her growing confidence, a dangerous undercurrent persisted, a magnetic tension between them neither dared fully acknowledge. The Duke's presence was not merely protective, it was consuming, an unspoken recognition of desire tempered by propriety. Clara caught herself stealing glances at him, noting the sharp angles of his jaw, the intensity of his dark eyes, and the quiet strength that radiated from every deliberate movement. She knew he was aware of her observation, felt it, perhaps, in the subtle tightening of his own posture whenever she looked. One evening, as snow fell lightly outside the manor's great windows, Clara found herself in the library, alone with Sebastian. The fire cast a warm glow across the room, and she could feel the tension crackling in the air, a silent current connecting them. "You have grown stronger," he said, voice soft yet commanding, "but you must not mistake safety for weakness. The world will always judge, always intrude. You must learn to stand for yourself, not merely rely on my protection." Her heart skipped. It was advice, yes, but also a challenge. He was asking her to embrace her own agency, to move beyond the protective cocoon he had provided. She felt the weight of possibility, the terrifying notion that she could be more than a victim. "I will try, Your Grace," she said, meeting his gaze. Her voice carried both determination and vulnerability. Sebastian nodded slowly, approving but not yielding. "Good. You are capable of more than you know, Clara Whitmore. Remember that, even when I am not near." That night, as she retired to her suite, Clara reflected on the transformation occurring within her. The bruises on her skin were fading, but the scars of memory lingered. Yet, for the first time, she believed in the possibility of healing, of growth, of a life unshadowed by fear. The Duke of Ravenshire had not only intervened in her life, but had ignited within her a spark that threatened to blaze into something powerful: self-worth, courage, and perhaps a nascent and terrifying hope of love. In the sanctuary of Ravenshire Manor, Clara Whitmore began to awaken not only from the chains of her past, but to the realization that life could hold more than survival. It could hold dignity, safety, and the quiet stirrings of the heart. And somewhere deep within, she knew that the path ahead, though uncertain, was now hers to choose. Society's judgment, word of Clara Whitmore's sudden presence at Ravenshire Manor spread through London like wildfire, whispered first among servants, then through salons and drawing rooms, until it reached the ears of the most influential figures of society. Rumors carried a sharp edge, sharpened by curiosity and scandal, each retelling growing more extravagant, that the Duke of Ravenshire, the feared and untouchable Sebastian Hale, had taken in a young woman of humble origins, sheltering her under his roof. Some called her a charity case, others a mysterious protégé. Many whispered darker insinuations, questioning her character and her motives. Clara felt the weight of the world pressing against the fragile sense of peace she had begun to build. No amount of comfort within the manor could fully shield her from the relentless scrutiny that accompanied her every move. Each carriage ride into the city, each encounter with a shopkeeper or acquaintance carried the unspoken question: who was this girl now inhabiting the home of a duke, and what right did she have to be there? She tried to focus on her lessons, on reading, on learning, on the small joys she could still seize. Yet even within the sanctuary of Ravenshire Manor, the whispers seemed to seep through the very walls. In the garden, servants' eyes lingered with curiosity. In the library, the occasional raised eyebrow marked judgment. In the corridors, distant voices carried hushed questions, clipped and sharp. Clara felt the familiar sting of self-doubt returning, a reminder that no matter how far she had come, society would always measure her against impossible standards. Sebastian observed her struggles with quiet patience. He noticed the way her shoulders tensed whenever the topic of society arose, how she flinched when a messenger arrived bearing letters or invitations, and how the light in her eyes dimmed at the first hint of criticism. Unlike others, he did not chastise or dismiss her anxieties. Instead, he met her gaze with the unwavering steadiness she had come to rely upon, a reminder that, at least here, she was safe from condemnation. "Clara," he said one afternoon, finding her in the drawing-room, her hands nervously fidgeting with a ribbon she could not untangle, "the world will talk. Let them. You must decide which voices matter and which are unworthy of your attention." Her lips trembled. "It is not just talk, Your Grace. It is my reputation, my life. They will believe anything about me." Sebastian stepped closer, placing a gloved hand lightly on her shoulder. "And if they do, will it change who you are, or will it only measure your worth by the ignorance of others?" The question struck her harder than she expected. Society had taught her all her life that survival meant obedience, secrecy, and silence. But here, under Sebastian's guidance, she began to glimpse another possibility, that value could be inherent and that courage sometimes meant defying expectation. Days passed, and the whispers grew louder. Invitations were withdrawn from salons she had never attended, notes were sent to her mother questioning her propriety, and a few of the more rigid aristocrats began to sneer at the audacity of the Duke of Ravenshire for offering protection to a woman of Clara's station. Each affront threatened to erode her confidence, yet she refused to retreat entirely. With Sebastian's presence, with the lessons she had learned, and the skills she was developing, she began to navigate this treacherous social landscape with measured composure. One evening, during a formal dinner in the Grand Hall, the tension of societal judgment became tangible. Clara, seated near Sebastian, felt the cool, critical gaze of Lady Ashbourne, a matron known for her sharp tongue and unforgiving standards. Every movement, every word Clara spoke was examined for imperfection. The slightest hesitation in her manners, the smallest mispronunciation of a phrase, and Lady Ashbourne's eyes would widen with subtle derision. Sebastian's hand rested near hers on the table, a steadying presence that reminded Clara she was not alone. When a servant brought a delicate dessert and she spilled a tiny portion of the custard, she felt her cheeks burn with the shame of exposure. But Sebastian's glance was reassuring rather than reproachful, allowing her to lift her head and meet the eyes of the observing aristocrats without crumbling under their scrutiny. "You handled that well," he murmured quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Do not allow them to dictate your worth." It was a small affirmation, but it bolstered her immensely. She realized that while society's judgment was inevitable, her own sense of self and the support she now had from Sebastian was far more significant. The lesson was not merely about survival, it was about asserting the dignity that had been denied her for so long. Yet tension remained. Clara could not ignore the persistent worry that her mother would exploit society's whispers to reclaim control over her life. Margaret Whitmore was cunning, manipulative, and relentless, and Clara feared the day her schemes would intersect with the fragile trust she was building. Each step forward in her confidence felt perilously close to the precipice of exposure, reminding her that even with Sebastian's protection, the world could be merciless. Despite the pressure, Clara began to recognize the transformation within herself. Where once fear had dictated every motion, now measured courage guided her. She spoke with authority in small conversations, defended her choices subtly yet firmly, and allowed herself brief moments of laughter and levity with the Duke, finding solace in the shared understanding between them. Society might scrutinize and condemn, but inside Ravenshire Manor, Clara was learning the invaluable lesson that her value was not defined by whispers or disapproval, but by the strength she nurtured within herself and the unwavering recognition of Sebastian Hale. Evenings often found them together in the library, the fire casting warm light across her face as she read aloud, Sebastian observing with that same quiet intensity that both comforted and unnerved her. There was an unspoken current beneath their interactions, the subtle weight of attraction, trust, and mutual respect, forming a delicate bond neither dared name yet. In these moments, Clara understood that the judgments of society were distant echoes compared to the immediate reality of her growth and awakening under the Duke's vigilant care. By the end of the week, Clara Whitmore could hold herself with a new posture of quiet confidence. The world outside Ravenshire Manor continued to murmur, to judge, to speculate, but within these walls she had discovered something far more potent, a sense of agency, a flicker of self-worth, and the beginnings of a life guided by her own choices rather than fear. Sebastian's protection was more than physical, it was an investment in her dignity, her intellect, and perhaps most dangerously, the stirring of her heart. Shadows of the past. Clara Whitmore had begun to taste freedom in the quiet routines of Ravenshire Manor, yet the past she thought she had escaped refused to remain buried. One gray morning, as a frost-laden breeze rattled the tall windows, a carriage arrived at the manor gates. The servants exchanged uneasy glances, whispering in hushed tones. Clara's heart tightened in sudden dread before anyone could speak. She knew, without knowing how, that her mother had come. Margaret Whitmore, relentless and cunning, had discovered the sanctuary Clara had found. Sebastian Hale, the Duke of Ravenshire, intercepted the messenger at the Grand Hall, his dark eyes narrowing as he read the note delivered in his hand. Clara felt her pulse quicken. "What is it, Your Grace?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother," he replied, voice taut with controlled anger. "She knows where you are. She intends to involve society in her schemes. You must remain calm and trust that I will handle this." Clara nodded, though fear churned like a storm inside her. She had spent years fleeing her mother's wrath, hiding from her cruelty and manipulation. Now, even in the safety of Ravenshire Manor, that shadow had followed her, threatening to undo the fragile confidence she had built. The day progressed slowly, every tick of the clock amplifying Clara's anxiety. She wandered the halls in restless pacing, the echoes of her own footsteps sounding impossibly loud. Servants moved quietly around her, a silent chorus of sympathy and caution. She was acutely aware of the scrutiny in the manor itself, as though the very walls expected her to falter under the weight of old fears. By afternoon, Margaret Whitmore arrived, escorted by a social acquaintance whose presence seemed designed to bolster her authority. She entered the drawing room with a calculated grace, her gaze sweeping over Clara and landing finally on Sebastian Hale. The Duke's presence was formidable, yet Clara sensed a subtle shift in tension, a prelude to confrontation that could erupt at any moment. "Clara," Margaret began, her voice laced with false warmth, "my dear, it has come to my attention that you are living under the Duke's roof. Surely you understand the impropriety of such a situation." Clara's stomach nodded. The words were familiar, a weapon honed over years of manipulation and verbal cruelty. "Mother," she said, voice firm though her hands trembled slightly, "I am under the protection of the Duke of Ravenshire, who has ensured my safety. I am no longer subject to your authority." Margaret's eyes flashed with fury. "Safety! Protection! You speak as though you are above me now, above your family. Do you know the consequences of this scandal?" Sebastian stepped forward, his presence a barrier between Clara and her mother. "Margaret Whitmore," he said, voice low, controlled, yet carrying undeniable authority, "you will not manipulate or threaten her under my roof. If you persist, I will ensure that society recognizes your actions for what they are, abuse, not discipline." Clara's heart surged. Sebastian's unwavering defense, the same power that had saved her in the ballroom weeks ago, anchored her in courage she didn't know she possessed. Yet Margaret was cunning, and the battle for control was far from over. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "You cannot shelter her forever, Duke. Sooner or later, the world will see what she is, and she will be nothing without my guidance." Clara's chest tightened, but she held her ground. "I am not nothing," she said, louder now, voice steady, "and I will not return to fear and cruelty." The tension between them was palpable. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, realizing that the usual threats, intimidation, and manipulation would not sway either Clara or the Duke. Sebastian's gaze, dark and unwavering, held Margaret in check, the promise of consequence simmering beneath the surface. Over the following days, Margaret attempted subtle intrusions, invitations withdrawn, society gossip stoked, and attempts to isolate Clara from her new support network. But each action was met with careful, deliberate resistance. Sebastian ensured that every affront was met with decisive response, whether through social maneuvering or quiet reinforcement of Clara's boundaries. Clara herself began to assert her own agency, practicing courage she had never thought possible. She spoke openly to Sebastian about her fears, her dreams, and her desire to confront her past, rather than remain a victim hidden away. Together, they developed strategies to navigate Margaret's manipulations while maintaining Clara's dignity and growing independence. One evening, as snow fell softly against the windows, Clara and Sebastian walked the garden paths under the pale light of the moon. The air was cold, crisp, but Clara's heart felt lighter than it had in years. "I am frightened," she admitted, voice low. "I do not know if I can face her fully." Sebastian's hand found hers, a grounding force. "Fear is natural," he said gently, "but courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing to stand even when trembling. You are far stronger than you know, Clara Whitmore. Do not let the past dictate your future." Tears pricked her eyes, not from sorrow, but from recognition. For the first time, Clara understood that she was capable of confronting the shadows of her past. She had a protector, yes, but she also had her own strength, a strength nurtured under Sebastian's guidance, sharpened by experience, and now ready to meet her mother's challenge head-on. The shadow of Margaret Whitmore would not vanish easily, yet Clara no longer cowered beneath it. In the presence of the Duke of Ravenshire, she felt emboldened, aware that her dignity, courage, and emerging self-worth were shields more formidable than the manipulations of the past. And as she walked alongside Sebastian through the snow-kissed garden, she allowed herself a daring thought, that perhaps, finally, she could shape her own destiny, free from fear and fully alive. Choosing herself. Clara Whitmore awoke to the soft light of dawn streaming through her bedroom window, the pale morning casting delicate patterns across the polished floor. For the first time in years, she felt a quiet sense of clarity, as if the world had shifted subtly while she slept. The shadows of fear that had clung to her since childhood still lingered, but they no longer dictated her every thought or action. Today, she resolved, she would choose herself. The manor was hushed as she moved through the corridors, the only sounds her own footsteps and the distant crackle of the kitchen hearth. Each step felt measured, deliberate, a small act of reclaiming power over a body and life that had been dominated by her mother's cruelty. She paused before a full-length mirror in the gallery, studying her reflection. The bruises beneath her sleeves had faded, though faint traces remained as reminders of the past. But in her eyes, something new glimmered: determination, resilience, and a budding self-respect that no hand could strike away. Sebastian Hale entered quietly, his presence filling the room without a word. The Duke of Ravenshire had grown accustomed to Clara's emerging confidence, observing the subtle changes in her posture, in the tilt of her chin, in the way she held herself within the scrutiny of society. He approached her slowly, aware that today, like every day since he had intervened on her behalf, required patience. "You are restless," he said softly, though his eyes betrayed a quiet admiration. Clara turned toward him, her voice steady. "I must face her, Your Grace. I cannot continue hiding. I will not allow fear to rule my life any longer." Sebastian's gaze darkened slightly, a mixture of caution and pride. "Margaret Whitmore is relentless. She will test you, but if you are certain, I am certain. I am done being afraid. I am done allowing her to dictate my life. I will not return to the shadows." The Duke studied her for a long moment, then nodded, placing a reassuring hand near hers. "Very well. Then you shall face this challenge with the dignity and strength you have cultivated. And know this, you do not face it alone." Clara felt a surge of warmth. She had grown accustomed to relying on Sebastian's protection, yet today was not only about his support, it was about her own courage, her own voice rising above a lifetime of oppression. Later that day, Margaret Whitmore arrived at Ravenshire Manor once more, her presence as calculated and formidable as ever. Clara met her gaze without flinching, her posture unyielding. The ballroom was empty save for them and the Duke, the silence thick with unspoken tension. "You have become bold," Margaret began, her tone sharp with disapproval. "But boldness will not shield you from the consequences of your actions, Clara." Clara's breath was steady. "Boldness is not what shields me, Mother. Strength and self-respect do. I will no longer allow your cruelty to dictate my life." Margaret's lips tightened, fury flashing in her eyes. You forget your place. I raised you. You taught me fear, Clara interrupted, voice unwavering. But I have learned courage elsewhere. I have learned my worth, mother, and it is not yours to decide. The Duke's dark gaze met hers, approving yet watchful. Margaret faltered under the twin weight of Sebastian's authority and Clara's newfound confidence. The room, once a battleground of intimidation, shifted subtly as Clara took her first true step into agency. She was no longer the trembling girl of past years. She was a woman reclaiming her life. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. You believe yourself untouchable under his protection? Clara lifted her chin. I believe in myself. I do not need protection to know my value, though I am grateful for guidance. I am done hiding. I am choosing myself. For the first time, Margaret seemed uncertain, unsure how to counter words that carried the weight of self-possession. Sebastian, standing beside Clara, allowed a small nod of pride to escape, though his face remained composed. He knew that the battle was not only against Margaret, but against the lingering shadows of fear Clara had carried for decades. And yet, in this moment, he recognized the victory that had been earned not by him, but by her courage. The confrontation ended without further escalation. Margaret retreated, frustrated but unable to dismantle the barrier Clara had erected within herself. Clara, meanwhile, felt a lightness she had not known in years, the exhilaration of stepping fully into her own agency, the thrill of claiming her life for herself rather than as an extension of her mother's control. That evening, Clara and Sebastian walked through the manor gardens, the moonlight reflecting off the frost-covered hedges. You were magnificent today, he said quietly, his voice low but charged with admiration. I had to be, Clara replied, her gaze steady. Not for anyone else, for me. Sebastian reached for her hand, a touch that spoke of connection, support, and unspoken affection. And I am proud, he said simply. You have become the woman you were always meant to be, strong, brave, and undeniably remarkable. Clara felt a swell of emotion, the mingling of relief, pride, and the faint stirrings of something deeper, an intimacy that had grown slowly, deliberately, in the safety and guidance of the Duke of Ravenshire. She knew that the path ahead would not be free of challenges, but for the first time she felt equipped to face them, not as a victim, not as a shadow, but as herself. And in the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the soft whisper of winter winds, Clara Whitmore chose herself fully, embracing the woman she had fought to become and the life she now had the courage to claim. Love declared without fear. The morning of the assembly arrived, and London was alive with chatter and expectation. Word had spread like wildfire. The Duke of Ravenshire, Sebastian Hale, would be present alongside Clara Whitmore, the young woman who had captured not only his attention, but the whiskered curiosity of society. The grandeur of the assembly hall was breathtaking, soaring ceilings, gilded moldings, and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbows across the polished floors. Yet to Clara, the beauty of the room mattered little. Her heart thumped with both fear and anticipation. Today was not about society's judgment. It was about the truth she had fought to embrace and the man whose eyes had always seen her worth. Sebastian arrived first, impeccably dressed, his presence commanding and resolute. Every gaze fell upon him, the Duke, whose reputation was feared as much as it was respected. Yet when Clara entered beside him, all whispers of scandal were replaced by a ripple of astonishment. Here was the woman society had assumed fragile, timid, and delicate, standing with composure, her chin held high, her gaze unflinching. The contrast between expectation and reality sent murmurs through the crowd. For Clara, the assembly was more than a social obligation. It was the culmination of every lesson, every act of courage she had claimed under Sebastian's guidance. She moved with grace, her training evident in the subtle poise of her gestures, the calm of her speech. Yet beneath the surface, adrenaline coursed, reminding her that societal scrutiny was unrelenting and unforgiving. A particularly haughty countess approached, her lips tight in disapproval. "Miss Whitmore," she said, voice cool and clipped, "I trust you understand the impropriety of—" "Countess," Clara interrupted politely but firmly, "I understand my past and the expectations of society, but I also understand my present, and I am here under the protection and endorsement of the Duke of Ravenshire. I am not a subject of judgment. I am an individual with my own dignity." Gasps spread through the room. Even the Countess faltered, caught between societal norms and the undeniable authority of the Duke standing beside Clara. Sebastian's hand brushed subtly against hers, a private reassurance, as if to remind her that he would not allow her to face this scrutiny alone. When the Duke finally spoke, the assembly fell silent. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of unyielding conviction. "Clara Whitmore is under my protection and my respect. Those who question her worth do so at their peril, for she is no longer a shadow to be whispered about. She is a woman of courage, intelligence, and unassailable dignity, and she has my heart." The room erupted, a mixture of shock, admiration, and disbelief. Clara's cheeks burned with both embarrassment and something deeper, an unspoken joy. Sebastian's words were more than a declaration. They were a shield, a challenge to the rigid expectations of society, and a confirmation of the bond they had nurtured in the quiet corridors and snowy gardens of Ravenshire Manor. Clara lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes with unflinching certainty. "And I stand with him," she said softly, yet clearly enough for those nearest to hear. "Not as a dependent, not as a subject of pity, but as a woman who has chosen to claim her own life, alongside the man whose heart has seen mine." Sebastian's expression softened, pride and affection mingling in the intensity of his gaze. The whispers of scandal were replaced by stunned silence. The judgment of society could not pierce the fortress of truth they now inhabited together. Throughout the evening, their connection was undeniable. Each gesture, each glance carried an intimacy that transcended the expectations of the assembly. Guests observed the union of courage and authority, the merging of two souls who had faced fear and oppression and emerged stronger, united not by obligation, but by choice and mutual respect. As the assembly drew to a close, Clara found herself standing with Sebastian in a quiet alcove, the warmth of his presence grounding her in a reality she had only dared to dream of. "You have done more than survive," he whispered, his lips brushing the side of her temple. "You have flourished, and you love me," Clara finished, the words no longer unspoken. "Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because you see me for who I am." Sebastian nodded, capturing her hands in his. "Yes, and I will not hide it. The world may judge, but I do not. You are my heart, Clara Whitmore, my choice, my woman." Tears glistened in her eyes, but they were tears of triumph, of liberation, of a love that had been fought for and claimed against every shadow of fear and cruelty that had once dominated her life. In that quiet moment, amidst the grandeur and judgment of society, Clara understood that love could indeed be declared without fear, and that her life, once defined by oppression, was now hers to command, with courage, dignity, and the unwavering devotion of Sebastian Hale by her side. A future rewritten. The first morning of their new life together dawned clear and crisp over Ravenshire Manor, the sunlight glinting off the frost that clung to the garden hedges. Clara Whitmore stood at the balcony, breathing in the cool air, and felt a serenity she had never known. Gone were the years of fear, the endless shadows cast by her mother's cruelty. Gone were the nights trembling at imagined threats and the days spent hiding in silence. Now, with Sebastian Hale, the Duke of Ravenshire, at her side, her life was hers to live fully and without apology. The manor had taken on a warmth that had been absent before, light streaming through tall windows, the scent of fresh flowers filling the halls, the quiet laughter of servants who moved freely without the oppressive weight of judgment. Sebastian joined her at the balcony, the familiar, steady presence that had become her anchor through trials and triumphs. He placed a gentle hand over hers, a touch both comforting and possessive in its quiet assertion. "You have come so far," he said softly, his voice carrying the unshakable confidence he had always inspired in her. From a girl cowering under shadows to a woman who commands respect, courage, and grace, I am proud to walk this path beside you. Clara turned to him, eyes glistening with gratitude and love. I could not have done it alone, she admitted. You believed in me when no one else did, and now I believe in myself. Sebastian's lips curved into the faintest smile, and he pressed a tender kiss to her temple. And now the world will see what I have always known, that Clara Whitmore is extraordinary, and her place is not beneath the weight of fear, but beside me, as my equal, my partner, my heart. Days turned into weeks, and life at Ravenshire Manor settled into a rhythm of shared purpose, mutual respect, and deep affection. Clara engaged in charitable work she had once only observed from the shadows, her intellect and insight earning her admiration beyond the walls of the manor. Sebastian remained her steadfast confidant and protector, yet he allowed her independence to flourish, understanding that true love does not demand dependence, but nurtures strength. The whispers of society had not entirely faded, but they had lost their sting. Clara's courage, integrity, and the undeniable bond she shared with the Duke spoke louder than rumor or gossip. For the first time, she walked with her head held high, fully aware of her own worth and unafraid of those who might try to diminish it. One evening, as twilight bathed the gardens in hues of violet and gold, Clara and Sebastian walked hand in hand along the frost-kissed paths. The wind carried a quiet promise of the future, one filled with hope, respect, and the kind of love that could endure every trial. Clara paused, gazing at the horizon. I never imagined life could feel like this, she murmured, voice tinged with awe. Sebastian tightened his grip on her hand. You have earned it, Clara. Every bit of happiness, safety, and love that comes to you is the result of your strength and courage. You chose yourself, and in doing so, you changed your destiny. As night fell and the stars glittered above Ravenshire Manor, Clara Whitmore felt a profound sense of belonging. The once abused girl had stepped into her power, claiming a future defined not by fear or cruelty, but by dignity, courage, and love. And standing beside her, Sebastian Hale, the Duke who had seen her worth from the very beginning, would walk with her every step of the way. Conclusion. Clara Whitmore's journey reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, strength lies within the choice to stand and reclaim your life. No cruelty, no shadow from the past, and no societal expectation can define your worth unless you allow it. True courage is found in embracing your own voice, your own decisions, and your own dignity. It is never weakness to ask for help, nor is it shame to step into guidance. What matters is the bravery to rise, to confront fear, and to choose yourself above the expectations or oppression of others. When you claim your worth, you inspire not only yourself, but those who witness your strength. Love, protection, or support are gifts to be embraced, but the ultimate power belongs to you. The power to stand tall, to define your path, and to create a life shaped by resilience, courage and unwavering self-respect. Let Clara's story serve as a reminder. No past defines your future, no cruelty can diminish your spirit, and the life you dream of is always within reach when you choose yourself first.